So it looks like Space Marines have got a massive power boost from this Arks of Omen update. Let's talk through their core rules changes and points updates, and look at some of the units that are going to be scariest going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where over the past day or so we've been talking about the monumental changes that Games Workshop has made to the game with Arks of Omen, a bunch of core rule changes to Warhammer 40k, and then some rather enormous points and rules changes to just about every faction in the game, with arguably the poster boy Space Marines being one of the armies that have had the biggest shake-ups. Perhaps the single biggest thing are the vast points cuts they've gone through their codex. We'll go through and take a look at each and every one in a second, but we'll also talk through their core rule changes and their objectives. First up, for the rules changes for Space Marines, as we know, Armour of Contempt is now gone, arguably a big durability nerf, though it does look like Games Workshop have dropped the points costs of just about everything in the codex to compensate quite well. It does mean that any individual Space Marine is generally going to be a bit easier to kill, though because the points costs have all dropped down, it does mean that in general the army is going to be putting out a lot more damage for the points costs. Generally Marines are going to be a bit more fragile, but very, very hard hitting. It does mean a bit of a rethink as to which units are good and bad again though. In the Armour of Contempt era, most Storm Shields were kind of passable but usable. Now I'd say it's probably going back to the time where just about any unit that can take one probably wants to. You get the +1 to save and the 4+ invul, that's almost always going to be worth it for the 5 points or whatever it is. There's also going to be a bit more focus on things with invul saves as well. Anything that gets an invul save at base, like say Contempt to Dreadnoughts or Black Templars with their 5+ invul vow, all of those are going to be more useful. Arguably, I'd say that the Armour of Contempt change probably hits things with 2+ saves worse, so things like Terminators, Land Raiders and Centurions are going to be a bit less durable than you might have expected previously. Some of them have gone down enough to compensate, I think, but maybe some of them are a bit more equivocal. Otherwise, besides that, there's the combat doctrine change. Basically, the change being is that you don't have to progress your combat doctrines anymore. You could sit in Devastator Doctrine all game long, or when you progress to Tactical on turn 2, you don't have to move on to Assault Doctrine in the later turns. In theory, this could be helpful for a fair few chapters, not going to be very relevant for the ones that want to get to Assault Doctrine straight away, but certainly it looks like Iron Hands are going to be major winners out of this. Their Devastator Doctrine is pretty excellent, allowing you to move and fire heavy weapons with infantry for no penalty, and also getting reroll ones to hit on heavy weapons game-wide. My guess would be that Iron Hands are probably going to be the strongest way to play Space Marines after this update. The change is certainly somewhat useful to some of the others though. Ultramarines getting their move and rapid fire bolters into the late game, Salamanders keeping up their Flamer and Melter buffs into turn 4 and 5, and it's kind of interesting for Dark Angels Raven Wing as well. They'll be able to get their movement buffs all the way through the game if they want them. The other major Space Marine rules change was their troops on objectives, the sticky objectives type rule. The rule is that if you control the objective in your command phase, then your troops unit can move off, and that objective still counts as yours until your opponent can get some boots on it. It means that say if you've got some Space Marine troops on an objective, you could have that taken, and then you could use them to just be aggressive and attack the enemy, maybe take a further objective up the field. And if the enemy's not got any units that can move on to that objective, you can consider it safe for a bit at least. I guess it gives Space Marine troops a little bit more relevancy, but I do feel that it's still going to be an option just to run no troops whatsoever now in the Arks of Omen detachments. Even with the points buffs that troops got, I feel like Space Marines are an army that can quite happily run no troops whatsoever. They do have that Rights of War warlord trait where you can give Obsec to a bunch of your elites, and that could certainly go some way to helping you take those objectives off enemies with Obsec. Finally, we have the points changes, and the general upshot is that almost every single datasheet in the codex went down. Either the base cost dropped or any war gear became free, and a few of them got both. The amount of free war gear is kind of interesting. It's certainly changed some optimal loadouts. For example, it now doesn't make any sense to field a Predator without sponsons, for example. And a lot of units that could say pick between multiple different heavy weapons might often want to pick the most expensive one. In today's video, I thought we'd focus on the changes for the core codex. Hopefully I will get round to doing the individual chapters later with their points changes, but I thought we'd start out with the core Space Marine codex changes as there's so much going on here in the first place. Let's take each section of the codex in turn and see what we've got. First up, we've got the troops choices. As mentioned, these guys will be benefiting from that sticky objectives type rule, and I feel like that could be a good reason to take at least a few troops along in a Space Marine list, even if you are mainly focusing on dangerous damage dealers. First up, we've got the different flavours of Intercessor. Standard Intercessors went down to 18 points or a 10% drop, but you get a free grenade launcher and Thunderhammer if you want one on the unit. Certainly Intercessor Sergeants with Thunderhammers or Power Fists included for free are quite threatening, and the squad's going to be a lot more threatening in combat than it was before. The Assault Intercessors are kind of a similar story. They drop down to 17 points, and again they get the free Thunderhammer as well. Basically for the points cost, both of these are going to be just generally a lot more dangerous in terms of damage, but durability wise are maybe going to be somewhat equivocal due to the Armour of Contempt nerf, meaning that they're just a fair bit easier to kill with weapons with AP. Admittedly though, Armour of Contempt not being a thing for other factions does help out a bunch of Space Marine choices. Say for example, Assault Intercessors with their AP-1 chainswords are going to be pretty dangerous against the field now. Finally for the Intercessors, the Heavy Intercessors got a pretty massive points cut. They went from 28 points all the way down to 23, a huge 18% points cut, and they also get their Heavy Bolter option as free too. They don't get any free Thunderhammers or anything like that, but I must admit they do look really quite interesting for objective camping if you're willing to invest a little bit more points. 115 points worth of 15 Gravis Wounds on an objective with OBSEC does look like a bit of a nightmare to remove, though they are going to be competing against Space Marines without OBSEC as damage dealers as a result. Say for example, they would cost the same amount as just a standard Devastator squad on an objective with las cannons who might not have OBSEC, but they're going to be putting out a whole load more firepower. The Phobos troops also did very well. Incursors dropped down to 18 points, the same as Intercessors now, and they get their Haywire Mine for free. I'd say Incursors were perhaps the most commonly run troops for Space Marines previously to this, so getting a fairly generous points cut certainly doesn't do them any harm. I guess they won't be getting the free Thunderhammers that the Intercessors and the Assault ones do though. I feel like they might have had a bit more of a side grade than most potentially, as they really just want to be surviving on objectives, so durability is big for them. It maybe matters a bit more than their damage output. Infiltrators are 20 points, they've lost 4 points, so another very big cut there. Their Helix Gauntlet is also free, and that's actually pretty useful as that is a good survivability buff. It allows them to ignore the first failed save per turn. I'd say in terms of comparing the Incursors and the Infiltrators have gained a fair bit on the Incursors out of this update. The two seem just a little bit more balanced than before, particularly as that Helix Gauntlet upgrade is so good. Finally, the Tactical Squad, rather than getting a points cut, just got a whole bunch of free gear. In particular, they can take a multi-melter completely for free, as well as a Thunderhammer on the Sergeant, and potentially a free combi weapon on the Sergeant as well. I feel like out of the update, again they've probably gained a fair bit on the Intercessors, which I would have put them fairly solidly behind before. A free combi weapon and multi-melter really makes them a lot more threatening than you might expect, and I feel that out of the update, the Space Marine troop section is overall a fair bit more balanced than before. Will be interesting to see how much people make use of it and which units they tend to pick. I think it's hard to go too far wrong with just about any of these, to be honest, but I'd say that you probably just want to just include a few units as opposed to loads of them in Space Marine armies, and focus more of the points on the elite's fast attack and heavy support as the more efficient damage dealers. I feel like you could probably still make a good argument for just cheaper Phobos Marines on midfield objectives. I guess they do things for the mission that wouldn't be quite as doable for the others, but getting the extra melee threat on the Intercessors is great, and the Tactical Squad is more takeable than ever. Moving on, and to perhaps one of the most exciting selections for the Space Marines are the Elite choices, and there's been some pretty major cuts here. Perhaps one of the single biggest winners out of this whole update are the Aggressors. They've gone down to 30 points from either 40 for the Flamers or 45 with the Bolters, and I feel like they've got to be one of the most improved units out of the book. I feel like they are a unit that will feel the loss of Armour of Contempt fairly hard, but seeing as they're getting basically a 25% points cut on the Flamers or a 33% on the Bolters is probably something that you can deal with. Now both loadouts are the same. I'd say that the Bolters are probably just a little bit ahead unless you're playing Salamanders. They have kind of similar damage output, but the Bolters can do it at a longer range. Either way, they're a pretty cheap little units that can fight some elites in melee and put some smack down at light infantry at range. And even with the loss of Armour of Contempt, 30 points Gravis armour isn't the easiest thing to take out, at least for small arms. Veteran Intercessors are 20 points now, so went down 2. Again, they get free war gear, including things like Thunderhammers. I still feel like these guys are going to be eclipsed by the troops Intercessors. At least they get you objective secured where these guys don't. I'm not sure that the extra attack is quite worth the extra 2 points. The Centurion Assault Squad has got an interesting side grade. It's gone up to 60 points from 55, but again it's free war gear, the Hurricane Bolters are free, plus the Melter Guns used to be 5 each and are also free. If you were just running them with Hurricane Bolters and Flamers, then they've dropped down 8%. I feel like that's maybe fairly balanced out by them losing Armour of Contempt, to be honest, so maybe it isn't the greatest thing in the world. If you wanted to trade out those Flamers for the Melters though, I guess you've saved a bit more. I guess if you can Alpha Strike them in armies like Raven Guard, they've got a bit more efficient now. Reavers are the cheapest standard Space Marine bodies in the book. They've gone down to 16 points, a -2 compared with 18 before, plus they've got their mobility options for free, the Grav Shoot and the Grapnel Launcher. Even at this price, I feel like they're still probably going to be outcompeted with the troops who get the objectives secured and those nice new objective rules. If you did want to include one of them as a utility unit though, 80 points really isn't too bad for 5 Space Marine bodies. They're still just going to be a bit limited though, with their leadership shenanigans being better against certain things, and their damage output being very anti-infantry. Scouts drop down to 12 points, so they've gone down 2, but they also get things like free missile launchers, camo cloaks, and the sniper rifles remain free as well. 60 points for a forward deployment unit I think is actually getting to the point where that's fairly well balanced against the Phobos Marines. Now you don't need to fill troops choices, I feel like Scouts might have a bit more of a role with that. With one wound they're certainly a fair bit more fragile, but then you are investing far less in them, and arguably I think you could say that their firepower is perhaps a bit more useful than the Phobos Marines are. Another one of the biggest winners out of this update, I think, are the Terminator squad. Terminators will be hit hard by losing Armour of Contempt, but I feel like their points have dropped enough to balance that out, at least for the expensive versions. Literally all Terminators in the book are 33 points now, whether you're Relic Terminators, regular Terminators, or Thunderhammer Terminators. I feel like it has made some of the variants better or worse. The Relic Terminators were previously very nice because you could take cheap loadouts like Lightning Claws and Storm Bolters on them, but now that's a fair bit less relevant because the other more expensive versions of the Terminators now cost just the same. I think the regular Terminator squad is pretty interesting as they can be packing Cyclone missile launchers within the squad for no extra cost. Grab that and load up on some chain fists and you've got quite a good all-rounder unit. But my personal favourite out of these are 33-point Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators, who are one of the few units that basically don't care at all about losing Armour of Contempt, so arguably they've dodged that nerf while still being really quite tough and have got a huge points cut. The Thunderhammer Storm Shield Terminators went down 24%, one of the bigger cuts in the book. I suspect that we'll be seeing a lot more of those guys on the table. Stern Guard are completely unchanged, they're 20 points, but all their gears included, including the normal 5-point combi weapons, all becoming free. If you're trying to make something like a big rhino or drop pod full of melter weapons work in salamanders, that's become a far more viable tactic, I think. And now that you don't have to take troops or anything, I feel like perhaps a lot of excitement about tactical squads getting free gear might just be a bit redundant behind the Stern Guard getting it. They're only 2 points more than tactical marines, have far more threat, and I feel like that might well be worth trading out the Obsec for. Vanguard veterans have interestingly had a small points bump. They've gone up to 20 points base when they were 19 before, though I would say that's probably outweighed by their power weapons and relic blades becoming free. Most of their upgrades and pistols got completely discounted, but there are quite a few things that still cost for them. Thunderhammers are 10 points, so they dropped 2. Power Fists are 5 points, they dropped 3. Jump Packs and Lightning Claws both remain 3 points, and the Storm Shield remains 5. Overall, I think that having the Relic Blade for free on the Sergeant is quite a big deal. That's going to give you one extra dangerous power weapon in the squad, and I think that's probably worth the extra points that they cost already. Plus, as one of the units that very happily runs Storm Shields already, they won't mind too much about losing Armour of Contempt. I think it would actually be kind of close now as to whether or not you take the Lightning Claws over things like Power Swords or Axes, seeing as they've dropped in points. I'd say perhaps the most interesting loadout for me might be Jump Packs, Storm Shields, and then Thunderhammers or Power Fists with a Relic Blade on the Sergeant maybe. Dreadnoughts and Stompy Walkers next, and the regular Dreadnought, Venerable, and Ironclad Dreadnought all get free gear. They didn't change in points cost, but you can now take things like 20-point las cannons completely for free, and that was quite a popular loadout. Means they'll be a bit more threatening for their points, but they will be a bit easier to take out. I feel like Armour of Contempt is quite a big loss for these 3+ save units without invuls. They're going to be saving on 6s or getting no save at all quite a lot more, unless you've got some way to give them an invul save. The Contemptor Dreadnought has got a small buff, that goes down 7% to 140 points. That's the book Contemptor, not the Relic Contemptor out of Forge World I just had. Basically, the Space Marine Forge World stuff more or less stayed the same. The Invicta Warsuit drops down to 140 points from 160, so a medium-sized cut there. Again, more threatening for the points, but I feel that that's hampered by the durability nerf quite badly. This thing is even more of a glass cannon than it was before now, and if the opponent gets first turn and gets the jump on it, then you're going to lose it quick. Still seems one that's going to be good for Ultramarines and friends, but much less good for other chapters. The Redemptor Dreadnought I'd also say is probably a net loser from this. Generally people tended to take the Onslaught Gatling Cannon and the Icarus Pod as upgrades, so if you were taking both of those anyway, then having them free drops it down to 185, but realistically that's quite a small points cut, and I feel like losing Armour of Contempt is a bigger deal for this one than that. I guess out of any of the units of the Space Marines, the Redemptor Dreadnoughts were perhaps some of the best already, but I feel like it's definitely lost some prominence in this update. Finally, for the Elite section, the Blade Guard Veterans are unchanged at 35 points, I guess losing Armour of Contempt isn't as big a deal for them. And the company veterans maybe are losing a bit of prominence as well. They still appear to be one of the only units that pay for their war gear, if you do want some tiny units of Space Marines about. Overall though, lots of big winners within this section. I feel like Aggressors and Terminators perhaps did particularly well out of this, and otherwise I feel like the Sternguard veterans and the Scouts might actually be surprisingly big winners too. Sternguard free war gear and very cheap Scouts with some actually half decent weapons isn't too bad. Moving on to the fast attack, and literally everything gains some good stuff here as well. The Assault Squad already had basically most of their gear free, they remain 18 points, but the last few bits that they did pay for have become free as well. You get the Eviscerator for free now, plus Melter Guns and Plasma Guns, and Power Fists. Again though, having lost Armour of Contempt, I feel like that's probably a side grade on the unit, and having a lot of other units that are very threatening go down in cost is maybe going to put them a bit more niche. Otherwise though, a decent winner for the slot I think is the Attack Bike. The multi-melter version dropped from 60 down to 50, so that's a good 17% drop there. They were pretty efficient firepower already with some buffs and things, and I feel like that's not going to change. The Invader ATV drops to 70 points, and if you were taking the multi-melter on that one, then that's 5 points off as well. It does seem to be at least fairly well balanced with the land speeders, which also get free multi-melters and assault cannons where relevant on their variants, though their base cost stayed the same. The storm speeders all dropped decently as well, the Hellstrike going down to 115, and the Hammer Strike to 125, and the Thunder Strike to 135. Bigger buffs to the Hammer Strike and the Thunder Strike relatively. I feel like they're probably also improved relative to Armour of Contempt. I feel like those guys were often just wanting to try and stay hidden and get the Alpha Strike on the enemy. Perhaps the durability is just a little bit less important as it wasn't enormously great to begin with. For the standard bike squad, all the special weapons became free. Again, same points cost, so less durable overall, but a bit more threatening with those extra guns. I guess interesting enough for armies like Raven Wing where they get the 5+ invul, which will be more relevant on them. Outriders got a fairly generous points cut as well. They were 50 points not so long ago, then they dropped to 45, and now they've dropped a further 10 points down to 35 points each, a big minus 23% cut. I think the Outriders will also really quite like that change to Armour of Contempt due to their AP-1 chainswords being a bit more relevant. I'm still not sure they're going to be one of the exciting Space Marine units in the fast attack though, just because they deal with infantry well but aren't so great against heavies. The Scout Bikers get all their war gear free. I'd say that they're still probably directly inferior to the Bike Squad though, unfortunately. And then we get to perhaps the biggest winners out of the fast attack slot, and maybe this entire update altogether, which is the terrifying power of the Plasma Inceptors. I feel like I might need to do a whole new video talking about these guys in the near future, but basically Inceptors stayed the same points cost at 40, but the Plasma Exterminators used to cost you an extra 20 points on top of that, and now they're completely free as well. It does mean that Plasma Inceptors are just flat better than the Bolter version at the moment, but the Plasma Exterminator loadout has gone down a crazy 33%, and these things are just generally effective at shooting just about anything that you point them at. They're fast moving and can deep strike if they need to, so they're very likely to get line of sight on what they want. They're not super durable, but they're not crazily easy to kill with 3 wounds at toughness 5, and certain armies can use them very very nicely, say with White Scars being able to advance and shoot those guns for no penalty, or Dark Angels using the Weapons of the Dark Age for damage 3 on that scary plasma. What's particularly terrifying and makes them even more general purpose though, is that each of those guns gets D3 plasma shots, but it goes up to a big 3 plasma shots if you're firing into units that have got 6 models or more. It means they're truly brutal into any sort of big infantry squad, and they'll just delete infantry in absolute droves. They obviously do have a bit of an issue with overheating if you choose to. Generally you'd probably want to have some sort of reroll ones on standby to make sure they don't just delete themselves at the same time as the enemy. But honestly, I could see these guys being a big staple in the vast majority of Space Marine lists. Great little units to jump out, blast something to death, and then probably get killed in return. Finally, the Suppressors I feel like I haven't received the same sort of love. They're 90 points for a squad of 3 with the auto cannons. They've dropped 10 points. I say that change is maybe a lot more in line with them losing Armour of Contempt, a bit more threatening damage, and I suppose they'll quite like the Devastator Doctrine for Iron Hands and things, being able to move and shoot those auto cannons and reroll ones all game long. Overall, solid buffs to the fast attack. I'd say that the Inceptors are probably by far the biggest winners here. Otherwise, though, I think that attack bikes, the Stormstreader Hammer Strike and Thunder Strike have both done well, and so has the Invader ATV and the Outriders. Moving on to the heavy support section for the Space Marines, and Devastator Centurions, kind of like their assault variants, have got a bit of a side grade. They've gone up rather a big chunk at a big plus 15 points boost. Previously they were 55 points base, though I guess they had to pay for at least the grav cannon, meaning they'd be 65 really, and it means that strangely the grav cannon loadout has actually got 5 points more expensive despite losing armor of contempt. The heavy bolter loadout though, with heavy bolters and either the missiles or the hurricanes, has dropped by 5, but the most interesting I think now is the las cannon loadout. That's gone down 15 points, or around an 18% points cut, which is genuinely quite good. I've seen people discussing these quite a bit online, and I don't think they're too bad. Again, on paper they seem to be one of the big winners that could make out quite well with the Devastator Doctrine change for things like perhaps Imperial Fists or Iron Hands. Realistically though, I would bear in mind that they are quite big losers out of the Armour of Contempt change. Anti-tank weapons will be taking them down really quite efficiently indeed now that they aren't getting the extra pip of save, and in general people didn't tend to be taking them all that much before. They weren't considered enormously strong. Still though, I feel like it's probably put them in the range where they'll probably be at least considered again. It does perhaps seem to be the order of the day for Space Marines that a whole bunch of units are going to be a lot more dangerous, but also a bit more easy to kill. Next up, the Devastator Squad I think have also done really quite well out of this. Heavy weapons and the Sergeant War Gear are all free. The only exception is multi-melters for the regular Devastator Marines. They cost plus 10 each. In general though, again, that these guys will absolutely love the Doctrine change, particularly if you're playing Iron Hands. Previously people really liked to spam out those grav cannons as they were quite cheap. I feel like las cannons will genuinely be a lot more of a viable loadout for them now though. 115 points for 4 las cannons and a combi weapon, plus an Armorium Cherub. If you did want to take the big multi-melter death squad, they still cost plus 10 points. A quad melter squad and a Cherub though has gone down to 155 points, so 20 less than it was before. So even that is significantly cheaper, and you also get a combi weapon thrown in. Overall I think that's probably better, as they generally tended to be quite alpha strike anyway, maybe jumping out of a drop pod or something, so being more efficient damage dealers seems like it's good news for them. Next up, the Hellblasters have dropped down to 30 points from 33, that's a 9% cut, and to be honest I felt like the Hellblasters probably needed just a little bit more help than that. I feel like that's probably going to be balanced out by losing Armour of Contempt on them, though I guess there's always the potential just to go for an absolutely mean plasma list, having a ridiculous amount of these guys plus the Plasma Inceptors. Next up we've got a bunch of tanks that actually went down in cost and also got free war gear. Basically the Gladiator and the Repulsor series of tanks all dropped in points, plus their bolt-on guns are free, and they were generally quite useful for the points cost, so I think that's another big win. The Gladiator Lancer is now just 125 points, pretty crazy that started on something like 200 or so when it came out. The Reaper's down to 150, and the Gladiator Valiant is now down to 170. They'll all be able to take the Stubber and also the Icarus pod for free as well, both of which are pretty nice little increases to their fire. Overall, I'd say that these things are all looking pretty solid now. They will all miss Armour of Contempt, of course, but I guess that can be a bit of a side grade for the Reaper, as the AP-1 gun will be far more relevant against all the things that used to have Armour of Contempt. Like the Devastators and the Devastator Centurions, these will also all love all-game Iron Hands Doctrine. Rerolling those ones to hit and getting extra AP all game long is another massive boost. I feel like something like a trio of Reapers chugging away with a crazy amount of AP-2 fire and re-rolling ones is going to be fairly intimidating, and while they might not be quite as hard to shift with Armour of Contempt gone, it's still not terrible on a 12 wound toughness 8 tank for 150 points. The Repulsors have also seen buffs of a similar sort of scope. The standard Repulsor is now down to 220, so a pretty big 50-point drop there, 19% plus free war gear. Kind of similar for the Repulsor Executioner as well. That's down to 250, so again a buff that's kind of in line with the Gladiator variants. The free war gear does seem actually pretty helpful for the standard Repulsor. That had some pricier options like the Onslaught Gatling Cannon plus las cannons and las talons and things. I feel like even with the loss of Armour of Contempt, both of those are going to come out a bit better. I feel like these things are going to be particularly enjoying armies that can give them an invul save in some way. Maybe things like that Librarian Psychic Fortress power, or perhaps even the Black Templars invul save vow. Who knows, with this plus the Devastator change we might finally have got to a place where the non-core firepower actually catches up a little bit with the core choices in Space Marines, despite having to have been buffed all edition to do so. Moving on to the rest of the heavy support, we've got a whole ton of units that didn't actually get any base points changes, but just instead got a bunch of free war gear. The Eradicators have done fairly well. Their heavy melter rifles have gone from costing 5 points each to free, and you can also bolt on that multi-melter too for no extra cost. Again, the heavy guns all like the Iron Hands and the rerolls doctrine, and again they're looking like a unit that's just getting massively more threatening, but perhaps losing a little bit of durability with Armour of Contempt. I feel like the Eradicators will be big fans of strategic reserve changes as well, jumping in from the side of the board. The Firestrike Servo Turret has had its last Talon loadout dropped down to 80 points, the same as the autocannon, I guess that's probably best now, and that's now down 28%. 4 las cannon equivalent shots hitting on 2s at that price actually isn't too bad. The thing I guess still does have some disadvantages, being very slow moving and kind of short ranged. For the tanks, I'd say that they've got some helpful changes, but nothing particularly big, and are probably overall still coming out a little bit weaker due to Armour of Contempt losses. The Hunter and the Stalker just pick up a free Stormbolter, so nothing big there. The Land Raiders get a free Hunter Killer Missile and a Multi-Melter and Stormbolter. I'd say for me that gaining the Multi-Melter probably isn't worth losing Armour of Contempt on the Land Raider. They're going to be significantly less durable as a result. They really quite lose big being a 2+ save unit. Predators I think actually haven't done too badly. They get their heavy bolter sponsons for free now, or can choose to upgrade to las cannons for an extra 10. A Predator Annihilator be 115 and get some free heavy bolters, which will be a bit more relevant post Armour of Contempt, but I still don't think it necessarily competes particularly well with the other choices. Eradicators, Devastators, and the Centurion Devastators probably still do better. The Vindicator gets a Siege Shield for free now, plus a Stormbolter. Again, probably overall just a touch weaker, losing Armour of Contempt. And the Whirlwind gets the Vengeance Launcher on its missiles for free. I guess overall a small win for that, as it probably doesn't care as much about Armour of Contempt generally being hidden. Finally, for unchanged units within the slot, we've got the Eliminators at 25 points. To be fair, they definitely didn't need to change. They're already doing great. They won't like the Armour of Contempt changes, but they will get some value out of Iron Hands being all game long if they want to. Moving and shooting those snipers or heavies with the B-rolls of 1 is a pretty nice thing for them. The Thunderfire Cannon also didn't see any change either, still going to be a bit underwhelming. Transport choices next, and the Impulsor is maybe the biggest winner out of these ones. 100 points down 10 from 110, and all the top hatch upgrades are now free as well. So if you wanted a Shield Dome Impulsor for the extra 15 points, that whole loadout has now dropped 25 points or 20%. I feel like you probably do want the Shield Dome now that Armour of Contempt is gone, plus it has a little bit more threat with the extra heavy stubber. It's still perhaps rather dependent on having good units that you actually want to deliver with it. In general though, I suppose it could be interesting enough for throwing out some intercessors at really quite a long range with their objectives secured. I feel like it could be particularly tempting in Black Templars as well, as you could do that same manoeuvre with throwing out a troops unit to a long distance, and then you wouldn't even need to take the Shield Dome with the Vow, you could swap it out for the Missile Launcher or something. The Rhino is 80 points, just gets an additional free Stormbolter, probably losing overall due to Armour of Contempt. The Razorback is 100 points, the same as it was before. Again, it's war gear free on that one, so you can pick up free las cannons or assault cannons over the heavy bolters. The assault cannons, again, are probably more relevant than they were, with AP-1 being better against the board. And drop pods remain 70 points, still doing what they do, and the Landspeeder Storm is still 50, probably a bit worse overall thanks to the Armour of Contempt changes. For the Flyers and the Fortification, again it's just completely free war gear on the Stormhawk, Stormraven and Stormtalon. I still wouldn't particularly rate the Space Marine Flyers strong. They weren't taken very much before, and arguably Arks of Omen have given them a further nerf in that you can't choose to start them on the board if you want to. Space Marines just feel like an army that's going to have all manner of units that can deal good alpha strikes but can't take a punch well, and I don't think that the Flyers are going to add anything much there. Overall, I think they still feel a bit weak. I feel like maybe the most improved might be the Stormraven overall, seeing as if you had the Hurricane Bolter sponsons, las cannons and multi-melters, that whole loadout drops by 60 points, a 19% cut. I feel like the Hurricane Bolter sponsons mean that the Stormraven actually comes out better from the free war gear compared with the rest. They're still going to be very easy just to gun down in return though if the enemy's got any sort of decent anti-tank fire. Perhaps one of the single biggest and most surprising changes though comes to the Hammerfall bunker. That one's down to 100 points from 175. A crazy 75 point cut, or minus 43%. I guess on paper that's the biggest winner in terms of percentage points changes. I feel that this thing's major problem was perhaps the rules though. It's hard to deploy with the fortification rules, and unless you're playing on a board with very little line of sight blocking terrain, then the heavy bolters just generally aren't going to do quite enough work. If you were playing on a very sparse terrain board though, a trio of these looks like it could actually be genuinely quite intimidating. They don't cost that many points, and I guess for 100 points they are fairly tough now. Maybe they could be okay at that new price tag as just an annoyance unit. If you know that you're going to be able to set one up in a good location, then I suppose why not? Finally, we come to the Space Marine characters, and in general it's good news across the board for these guys. Basically, Games Workshop has been kind of broad brush with these. Almost every single character with a fairly set loadout goes down 10 points, and most of the things that didn't have a set loadout generally have the majority of their standard war gear free. The main things that cost points now are just slightly more exotic things like jump packs or thunderhammers. The chapter command upgrades have all gone down 5 points each as well, things like the chapter master or chief apothecary upgrade, So if you were using those, they got even better. Some of those are basically auto-include if you're running the units, like say the Master of Sanctity for Chaplains. Captains-wise, the Phobos Gravis and Heavy Bolt Rifle cap all go down 10 points. The Primaris Captain is maybe one of the biggest winners, going down 10 points, and if you took the Indomitus pattern one, he's dropped a big 25 points off that model, so down 24% compared with his previous cost. I guess it's a good time to own the 9th edition starter captain. The Firstborn Captain variants in the Terminator, regular and biker one, they're all the same cost, but they do get their free war gear. The Thunderhammers are 10 points on the regular versions or 5 on the Terminators, and the on-foot version still has to pay for his jump pack if he wants one at 25 points. I'd guess still maybe being fast is perhaps most valuable, but if you did want an on-foot captain, the Indomitus pattern one with the Relic Blade and the Storm Shield does seem pretty cool. The lieutenants are kind of similar. The regular one remains 70 points but gets free gear besides the jump pack. The Phobos and Reaver ones are both minus 10 points, and the Primaris Lieutenant again is probably the biggest winner, minus 10 points to just 65 points, cheaper than the regular, and also gets free gear such as that Storm Shield, Sword, and Volkite pistol upgrade. I feel like that last one does seem pretty tempting. Librarians and Chaplains all go down 10 points across the board, both Firstborn and the Primaris variants. The only upgrade that you need to pay for on any of them is the jump pack on the Firstborn ones. I feel like the Chaplain on bike with the Master of Sanctity upgrade is quite nice now. He only costs 135 points overall, when previously he was 150. The Tech Marines go down 10 on the Primaris, and the regular one gets free war gear, including Thunder Hammers or Tempest Hammers if you want them. And then for the Elites characters, it's broadly just 10 points or 5 points off across the board. The Ancients, Apothecaries, and Judicia all went down 10 points. The Company Champion drops just 5 to 50. But again, broadly good news on all of those guys there. Not sure it really changes up too much which ones you want to take or anything. Apothecaries are still good. The Chief upgrade got a bit cheaper, and the Company Champion would often be upgraded to the Chapter Champion, and I guess that's still down 10 points overall for that loadout if you did want to make a very cheap melee combatant. Overall, out of these, I wouldn't say there's any massive changes to the HQ slots, besides they're all just a little bit cheaper than before. I guess in terms of relative value increase, the Indomitors Captain and Lieutenant did particularly well, as did anything that gets upgraded to a chapter command due to the additional 5 points drop. So overall, let's talk Space Marine objectives in just a second, but in terms of the biggest points cuts and the ones for the most relevant units, I feel like some of these might be really a shoe-in into Space Marine lists going forward. First up, I think that Thunderhammer Terminators are going to be a real staple in lists now. A huge points cut going from 43 points to 33, and Storm Shields got absolutely great again. Now it actually matters for taking them compared with regular Terminators with Armour of Contempt. If you want a big chunky melee unit to put buffs on, whether it's damage or durability, these guys seem pretty awesome. Plasma Inceptors, as mentioned, look like 40 points worth of danger per model. I could easily see Space Marine players spamming a fair few squads of these and breaking them down into combat squads, having small units jumping out, trading blows with the enemy, maybe dying fairly easily in return for their points cost, but generally I think they're a unit that could trade up and really bully other choices. Aggressors I think have also won pretty big, 30 points per model now with some volume anti-infantry fire and okay melee. At just 90 points for a small unit, they seem pretty reasonable to have as some threats moving up the board. I'm sure Salamander's players will enjoy them in particular with their flamethrowers. They're a good unit for a lot of their buffs and stratagems. Devastators and Devastator Centurions both did very well. Grav, Las Cannons and Multi-Melters are all decently cheaper for the standard Devastators. The Devastator Centurions will be doing nicely with their Las Cannons and perhaps missile launchers too, and they in particular will really like all-game Devastator Doctrine, even more so if you're Iron Hands. Otherwise, there really are a whole load of other units that got various buffs. Heavy Intercessors got a very hefty points decrease to 23 points, maybe a bit more interesting for those chunky Gravis guys now they've got that new objective rule. The Eradicators were already great, now you've got 3 heavy melter rifles and multi-melters that are even better. They absolutely love the Iron Hands Devastator Doctrine with moving and shooting and rerolls, plus strategic reserves being free is great for them as well. For bikes and vehicles, I'd say things are maybe just a little bit more of a trade-off with losing Armour of Contempt. That has hit quite a lot, and quite a few of them didn't get as big points cuts. I think attack bikes in particular have done okay though. They were already pretty good for the Melter Fire, and now they're even cheaper. And after the actual battle tanks and things, maybe the Gladiator Reaper might be one to watch. A few people were experimenting with them occasionally in competitive lists already. A big 25 point cut, some free war gear, all game Devastator Doctrine, and AP-1 mattering more just seems like it's all a really big cluster of things that'll help them out quite a lot. As mentioned, for chapters throughout all of this, I feel like Iron Hands are going to be doing very, very well going forward. The Doctrine change is absolutely massive for them, and it makes a lot of units so much more viable. Plus they've got a ton of great support options as well, good stratagems and psychic powers and warlord traits, and even if you didn't want to go for their original tactic, they're pretty viable as successors as well, maybe taking the combinations that make their assault units better, as their ranged units do pretty well just out of the Doctrine. Otherwise for chapters, I feel like Ultramarines and Salamanders have done okay out of the Doctrines as well. Salamanders will quite like Eradicators, Aggressors, and Thunderhammer Terminators doing well. Otherwise, I think that Dark Angel's Deathwing will certainly enjoy the Thunderhammer Terminators being cheap. Deathwatch look interesting with a ton of free war gear, and Black Templars look like they could be good on paper with their Invul Save Vow. That's a lot more relevant now Armour of Contempt has gone away. You'll be saving on that 5+ Invul so many more times. Finally, I thought we'd just touch quickly on Space Marine secondary objectives, another area where the Marines might have been having at least a little bit of trouble, and for the most part I'd say they've largely done well out of this. Some of these specific chapters though have lost some options. There's a decent buff to Codex Warfare, where you've got to kill enemies with the appropriate weapons in the right doctrine, so say heavy weapons in Devastator, melee weapons in Assault. You get 1 victory point per enemy unit killed with that, and now it doesn't cap out at 5 victory points for each one of those doctrines anymore, so it means that say if you stayed in Devastator Doctrine all game long and did all your kills with heavy weapons, that would tally up quite quickly. I still don't think it's an auto-include, the other kill ones might be better, but if the enemy's got a whole ton of units and you've got an army that's really focused on dealing damage in one particular way, then you're probably going to score fairly high on this without really trying too much. Oaths of Moment has also received a very big buff as well. This one's a 3-part one that used to be kind of auto-include for Space Marines, and maybe it might be again now. You have to try and kill characters, vehicles or monsters for a max of 1 VP a turn, don't fall back or fail morale for another 1 VP, and if you can have a Space Marine unit at the end of the battle round within 6 inches of the centre of the board, you now score 2 victory points. Previously that last point had been nerfed down to 1 victory point and it had to be a core or character. Both of those restrictions are gone though. It's going to be ridiculously easy to max this if you're going second, and even if you're going first it should be easy enough provided you've got a chunky tanky unit to park in the middle of the board. Otherwise the other generic one is Shock Tactics. That one isn't changed from the updated version that they did mid-season about 3 months ago. 4 victory points for controlling 1 or more objective markers that your opponent had at the start of the turn. Generally feels like that one's usually going to be a fairly mid-scoring one, maybe not maxing it out, but rarely scoring lowly if you're not just being utterly dominated in the game, perhaps a fairly reliable 8 or 12. Finally, for the chapter-specific secondaries, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but perhaps the big headline news is that the major Divergent chapters, so the Dark Angels and Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Death Watch, and Black Templars, they all just get the 1 extra secondary objective rather than having an extra 3 or 4. I guess that kind of feels appropriate if Games Workshop's going for some sort of parity. It did feel a bit weird having these guys with, say, 7 objectives they could choose from, where a lot of armies had 3. It definitely means their options are going to be a bit more restricted, though. Things like Dark Angels, Raven Wing not getting their Death on the Wind one will be a bit of a blow to them. Otherwise, the Codex ones are broadly fairly unchanged. The Iron Hands and Deathwatch ones looks like they've got some small buffs, but nothing enormous. The Salamanders one for defending one of their objectives was nerfed slightly, but still looks like it would reliably rack up the points. Overall, I'd say this amounts to decent improvement on Space Marine objective games. Oaths of Moment looks like it's a real contender once more, though it will usually be a big swing between whether you're going first or second, I reckon. And both Codex Warfare and Shock Tactics look usable, though they might compete a bit more closely with the other book ones. So anyway, broadly speaking, I feel like things are looking up for the Space Marines. Kind of interesting to have a situation where an army gets a major buff removed despite being weak, but then Games Workshop tries to overcompensate a bit for that with a whole load of points buffs and some special rule changes. As mentioned, I feel like we're going to be seeing a fair amount of Terminators, Inceptors, and Iron Hand Space Marines hitting the tables. It will be interesting to see what people make of these new Arks of Omen lists and what they choose to run. Let me know your thoughts though. What are you looking forward to playing with Space Marines going forward? Do you have any units that are going to be hitting the table after a lengthy hiatus? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I'll be trying to post some points and rules analysis videos for the vast majority of factions in Arks of Omen. Feel free to check out my other latest one on the Plight of the Chaos Space Marines. I'll link that down in the video description. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below as well. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to support, the link is in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.